NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So I'm going to talk about the racial impact of collateral consequences, and this brilliant lawyer who's going to follow me, Amanda David, is going to talk more practically about how we protect our clients from the onerous restrictions that follow them if they get convicted of an offense. Let's talk for a little bit, though, a little more detail about what collateral consequences are. And I know in the back you can't see this, but basically what they are the disabilities, penalties, disadvantages that people face once they get convicted of a crime. And they come in and they affect a number of areas. Employment, housing, education, financial. You might not be able to get a loan if you have a criminal record. Immigration is not up on this. Oh, civic participation is important. You may get barred permanently from voting if you're in one of 10 states. And then you have other situations where in some states you can't have your voting rights restored until you're released and you finish probation or parole. Only 2 states, by the way, Maine and Vermont, allow voting while you are in prison. But these are really, really, really onerous restrictions. Now you may wonder why I haven't said anything about immigration. There's a whole another conversation we could have about the immigration consequences of a criminal conviction. It's interesting now in light of Padilla versus Kentucky, whether the Supreme Court would even consider immigration consequences to be direct or collateral. In fact, in Padilla is the case that said that we must advise our clients of the immigration consequences of a conviction, and the court there said that, you know, this collateral direct distinction doesn't matter when it comes to immigration because of how closely connected immigration consequences are to criminal convictions. So just bookmark that. That's for another day. That's a different conversation. But to drive home just how onerous collateral consequences are, and really I think of them not as consequences, because that sort of is a euphemism. It's really punishment, even though courts wouldn't necessarily agree. I want to tell you about one client story. And this is Jean Mays up on the screen. Jean was in high school in the early 80s. He was number 1 in his high school class, just an amazing student, number 1. He was also the star basketball player on his high school team in Cincinnati. He had dreams of playing in the NBA, and if that wasn't going to work out for him, he wanted to be an electrical engineer. He made a mistake his senior year of high school where he was caught in the parking lot smoking marijuana. He got caught by one of his teachers. And as a result of that, he got kicked off the basketball team and suspended from school for a little bit. And if Gene were here today, he would tell you after that point, he basically had a fuck it attitude. Just fuck it. My dreams are dashed, fuck it. He eventually got back into school, wound up graduating. But when he graduated from high school, he also graduated from marijuana use to cocaine use, and eventually began smoking crack as well. And to finance his habit, he started selling drugs. Gene wound up getting 2 felony convictions for drug trafficking. He went to prison the very first time, actually. He didn't get a break of probation the first time, but he went to prison the first time. And the second time, he was able to actually get probation and started some treatment. But the treatment didn't stick at first. And he relapsed. And on a cold, rainy night in October of 1997, Gene had no money. He had no hope. And he was looking for a bridge to go jump off of. He was going to walk himself down to downtown Cincinnati and jump off the Roebling Bridge. But he got the courage to go home. And there waiting for him was his fiance, who called a friend from NA, got him back into treatment. That was the last night, that cold, rainy night in October of 1997, that Gene used alcohol or drugs. He then set about rebuilding his life. Dreams of becoming an electrical engineer, that wasn't going to happen for him with a young child on the way at that point. He couldn't afford to go back to school. But he did enroll in a union training program to become an electrician, a 5-year program where he was number one in his class. Not surprising, because he's really bright, brilliant guy. Each year in that program, he excelled, not only in the classroom, but with his apprenticeship employers, who raved about how good, how talented, how hardworking Gene was. He decided when he graduated from the union training program to apply to work for the city of Cincinnati as an electrician. He took and passed the civil service exam and then began interviewing for jobs. And the city of Cincinnati, or actually before the city actually communicated to Gene, he met with a number of different departments, one of which wanted to hire him to work as an electrician in the sewer district. And they basically said, "You are our guy, we want to hire you." But not so fast. As he was celebrating, waiting on getting the final paperwork from the city, he got another letter he didn't expect. And that letter said, basically, "We don't hire felons in the city of Cincinnati." And with that, Gene's dreams, his hopes, aspirations were dashed to work for the city, which was his dream. Because he was seen and defined by the city, as many people are who have criminal records. He was defined by his worst moments, by his criminal record. Now, we're going to come back to Gene at the end. So, why do I say that? You can't read that in the back, I know. It's basically asking the question, how do collateral consequences perpetuate racial inequality? So let's dive into that, because it's really an issue of numbers. And it's also an issue of intent. We're going to get there too. But just in terms of like, why so many people, I think it's helpful to know how many people are impacted by these collateral consequences. So this is what's on the screen is obviously it's a map of the United States, but it is filled with little bitty people to try and drive home a point. There are so many folks in our country who have criminal records. 70 million, by some estimates, have a criminal record of some sort. It's a lot of people. The United States has 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of people who are in prison. China is 4 times the population of the United States, and yet has 3/4 of the people in prison than we have. That is just breathtaking. I'm going to scoop through this next one. It pictures, it's a graph to get a sense of how many people are. What made you laugh there, Jeff? I know. Yeah. Okay. So a little over 20 million people are military veterans in this country. NCAA attendance, that is at about 50 million people. Households with a dog, it's a little short of 60 million. Married couples, again, we're not even there with the arrest records yet. There are the only categories here. We've got Obama voters in 2012. Again, that doesn't touch persons with arrest records. Persons with a bachelor's degree, that's about equal, actually, to people with arrest record at 70 million. Obese Americans, we have more obese Americans than we have folks with arrest records, and then homeowners. That is breathtaking. That is breathtaking. Now, I see Mark Maurer somewhere in the back there, and sorry I lifted this from your great work at the Sentencing Project, but this is a chart that maybe many of you have seen, certainly some of you have seen, that really hits home in terms of how folks in prison, how the distribution of folks in prison is skewed along racial lines. 1 in 3 African American men will spend time in prison, compared to 1 in 17 white men and 1 in 6 Latino men. 1 in 18 black women, compared to 1 in 111 white women, and compared to 1 in 45 Latina women. Again, the criminal legal system is not an equal opportunity institution. If you are a person of color, you are more likely to be trapped in this system, affected by it in some way. Now, this chart is just about imprisonment. It's not talking about who is touched, who comes through the doors of the courthouse and winds up with a record. But the data shows that if you are a person of color, you are much more likely to get charged with a crime in the first instance, convicted. And when you get convicted, that's when these collateral consequences come into play. All right, so I said it's about numbers when you're trying to think about the impact of collateral consequences. It's also about the number of laws that we have on the books that impose all manner of restrictions, be it employment, housing, student loans, a whole, just, you could fill up volumes of books, law books, with these restrictions. And we're not even talking, let's put aside for a second. We all know that even if there's not a law that says that you can't hire someone who's got this particular record, that private employers are very, very reluctant. Private landlords may be very, very reluctant to give people a shot if they've got criminal records. Just in my state of Ohio, we have over 800 laws on the books that restrict folks from working in certain fields. In Ohio, you might not be able, and this isn't a mandatory bar, but you might not be able to work as a barber if you've got a felony conviction. Imagine that. The one thing you might learn how to do when you're locked up is cut hair. And then the state's gonna say, oh, we're not gonna let you cut hair? Guess what happens when we take away people's opportunities and say you can't work in any field? It's a recipe for continuing the revolving door of prison release, prison release. In the state of Ohio, if you are someone who is gifted in terms of construction and you want to start your own construction company, guess what? You are mandatorily barred. You cannot own your own construction company. You can work a construction job, but you can't own your own company in the state of Ohio if you've got a felony conviction. That's nuts. And then we have restrictions on folks working in healthcare, in nursing facilities. And for many people who may not have a lot of skills, but have heart and want to take care of old folks, and then they're told you can't work in this nursing home, again, that just doesn't make sense. But there are lots of these laws, hundreds of these laws in every single state in our country. So why? Why do we have this regime? Well, I hope, how many people have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow? So a good number of people in the room. That's really fantastic and if you haven't read it, you should read it. Michelle's central thesis is that mass incarceration and the label that you carry as someone convicted of a felony, those two things have replaced Jim Crow era laws and the system of slavery that preceded it, and that it replaced them in terms of constituting a racialized means of social control. That's what it's about. And these restrictions that we've been talking about that are based in our laws legitimize the same sorts of discrimination that Jim Crow era laws put into place. So much of this is driven by race. And I don't care what state you're in. So many of these restrictions are driven by race and the need for social control of poor people of color. So I want to talk just for a couple of minutes just about the dynamics and how this really destroys communities. I was born in the South Bronx, and I'll never forget, I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. Who's been to the South Bronx? Who's been to Asheville? Are they similar or not? It's like Sesame Street. Which two things are, okay. Asheville, if you haven't been there, and it's changed since I was a little boy. I was bored to death in Asheville growing up, but now it's this kind of this hippie place, lots of good music and craft breweries and beautiful hiking and stuff like that. I grew up in Asheville, but I was born in the South Bronx. And when I was in college, I was spending a summer in New York helping homeless people as part of a project. And I wanted to go see the neighborhood that I would have, might have grown up on had we stayed in the Bronx. And this actually is not the street, but it looked an awful lot like it. Imagine getting off the subway and walking a few blocks, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and there's just this broken glass. I'll never forget it. Broken glass sort of shining in the sunlight. And a lot of folks who look like me, young men, standing on the corners, caught up in something. Look like maybe caught up in drug dealing. I don't know. It's possible it wasn't. But all those boarded up buildings with the broken glass will always stay with me. And when I moved to Cincinnati and first saw there's a neighborhood in Cincinnati called Over the Rhine. Now, it's changed because the city has developed that neighborhood and kicked out a lot of the poor folks. But it looked an awful lot like the South Bronx neighborhood I saw that afternoon some 20, almost 30 years ago now. And what was at play, I'm convinced, is this racialized means of social control that Michelle Alexander talks about, and just how devastating that is on communities. When people get into trouble and, are targeted for prosecution more than their white counterparts are, I'm talking about people of color, and they wind up branded with a criminal record that makes it so difficult to get work, this is what you wind up with, is a blighted neighborhood. Now, I'm not trying to be simplistic. That's not the only reason that we have neighborhoods like the South Bronx neighborhood I described, seeing that afternoon, and Over the Rhine 15 years ago. That's not the only reason, but it plays a part. These legal clinics that the Ohio Justice and Policy Center has around Cincinnati, we help folks, we call them second chance community legal clinics, and we help folks try and overcome the devastating impact of having a criminal record in terms of shutting them out of the workforce, keeping them from housing, and other things that many of us take for granted. The number one thing we hear time and time again is, I just want to work. Nobody will give me a chance because of my record. Can you get my record sealed? Can you get can you find some way to get my conviction vacated? And it's folks who want to be part of our community, and they're getting shut out from doing it. I'll never forget this one man who just said, "What do you expect me to do? I've got to feed my family some way." And we are letting down as a society our entire community when we tolerate and don't stand up and object and fight to get laws repealed that make it impossible in many instances, not necessarily impossible, but extremely very difficult in most instances, to be full members of the community, because that drives more crime and more blight and more hopelessness. Now, some might say, how the hell can you say there's hope in the age of Donald Trump? And I don't mean to offend anybody who may have voted for Trump, but, and there might be. What's that? Yeah, it might be. Why am I looking at you? I'm not looking at you, Cynthia. I'm looking off into space because I don't want to make eye contact with, no, and actually, you know what? In all seriousness, all of us in this room who are criminal defense lawyers, we have one thing in common. And that one thing in common is we don't write people off, period. And that means our brothers and sisters that we may not agree with politically. Just remember that. That's been hard for me to sometimes put into practice, but it's really important. And I'll get back to that in a second, about why that's important. But my point about the Trump administration is that, when we hear words out of Attorney General Jeff Sessions' mouth about the need to be tougher on crime and to instruct the United States Attorney's Office to bring the most serious charges, that's disturbing. That's disturbing. That's not making America great. It's going to make it worse. But I say there's hope because most criminal justice, if we want to say criminal justice, but most criminal justice policy happens at the state level. And so I am hopeful for a number of reasons. First, there has been a growing recognition of the problems that mass incarceration has wrought on this country, the failed drug war has inflicted on all of us. We should thank Michelle Alexander partly and others, many others actually, not just Michelle. And there's growing awareness of how this is ripping apart communities of color. That's a good thing that we have more awareness now. The other thing that has happened is we have, despite what may be said in Washington, we have bipartisan support for criminal legal system reform in a lot of states around this country. That's where it comes into not writing people off because you disagree with them. In Ohio, we have been very successful in working with people across the political spectrum to get reforms done. And I'm just going to say a word about that in my 3 minutes that remain. But we've got bipartisanship at the state level. Don't forget it. Ban the box laws. This is just one example of how there has been some progress. People know what ban the box is? It's basically employers not being allowed to ask the question on an application, at least initially, whether somebody's been convicted of a criminal offense. And usually the way it works is that a background check is done eventually, but not at the very, you don't have to disclose a criminal conviction in the beginning because there is a desire to get the most qualified people to apply for a position, which might be somebody with a record. And then after a record check is done, and if that person has a record, then and only then are some common sense questions asked, like how long ago did the conviction happen? What was it for? How relevant is that conviction to the job the person seeks to do? And what's the evidence of rehabilitation? I said I'd come back to Gene Mays because Gene, we were able with Gene's case, we didn't win in the courts. We tried to get his job through the courts. We couldn't make that happen. But what we were able to do is build a coalition of people who identify as liberal or progressive with conservatives, business people, law enforcement, people from faith community, and we were able to get the city of Cincinnati to change its law and basically create a ban the box law for Cincinnati. We were then able to take that to some other counties around the state and get those counties and cities to adopt ban the box laws. And then we got a conservative legislator to introduce a bill that passed and Governor Kasich signed into law in 2012. So it is possible to make this happen if we work together. And across this country now, we've got 150 cities and counties with ban the box initiatives and 29 states. So there's a lot more work to do in terms of collateral consequence reform, but it can and must be done, and we must work together to make that happen. Thank you.